Chapter 12, Algae. The learning objectives for this topic are describe the distinguishing characteristic of algae, describe the alternation of generations in algae, list 4 groups of algae and describe distinguishing characteristics of each, list several economic benefits derived from algae, list 4 ways in which water molds differ from true fungi. So we're going to cover algae in general and then the classification of algae. Under general, we will be talking about the characteristics of algae, distribution of algae, morphology, and reproduction. Algae can come in single-celled forms, others live in a colonial fashion, and others are true multicellular organisms. All algae are photosynthetic. In other words, they get their nutrition through photoautotrophy. Like multicellular fungi, multicellular algae have a thalli, which is the body. Now, for some forms, like this seaweed here, we have different structures. You have the holdfasts, which are kind of like roots, except for they don't perform the function of roots, except for to hold the algae to a rock or to the sea bottom. The stipes are like stems, and the blades are like leaves. Algae reproduce through 2 means. They undergo asexual reproduction, in other words, their cells divide through mitosis. They also reproduce through sexual reproduction. So let's go through the life cycle of the average algae. First, they start out as a zygote, a fusion of 2 gametes, so that they are diploid and they are genetically distinct from both parents. The zygote will undergo mitotic divisions so that each cell has 2 copies of all of the chromosomes so that they're diploid, and you get a diploid individual. Now within the diploid individual, meiosis will occur and you will develop male and female haploid spores. Now all algae live in the water, either marine or freshwater, so their spores are flagellated so they can swim through the ocean or through the lake. These cells will divide through mitosis. They're haploid because meiosis occurred up here. Each of these have only 1 copy of each of the chromosome. So the female haploid individual and the male haploid individual develop, and the males will produce male gametes and the females will produce female gametes. They're still haploid, so these gametes were produced through mitosis. Male and female meet, fuse, and you get a zygote. Now this is kind of funky because in animals, our gametes, our haploid spores, if you want to call them that, do not undergo mitosis and form individuals. But in algae and in plants, this does happen, and we call this alternation of generations. You have a generation where you have the diploid individual, and then you have a generation where you have male and female haploid individuals. On to classification of algae. And when we go through these various groups, I'll be talking about their economic benefits. So we're going to go over chlorophyta, rhodophyta, phaeophyta, crystophyta, and the water molds. First, the chlorophyta, or the green algae. Green algae are found in all sorts of marine and freshwater environments. They go all the way from colonial to multicellular organisms like the seaweed that you see here. They are most closely related to plants. Both chlorophyta and plants use chlorophylls A and B. They use starch and sugar as their food reservoirs, and at least the chlorophyta that are most closely related to plants use cellulose in their cell walls. Because of this, some taxonomic schemes put chlorophyta and plants together in the same group. So we've moved chlorophyta over to the kingdom Plantae in some situations. Green algae are part of the base of the food chain, and there are some forms that are used as human food. Rhodophyta, or red algae, are almost exclusively marine and multicellular. They're distinguished from the green algae by having this red pigment. Now remember, what we see as color is what's reflected. This red pigment allows the algae to absorb blue light. And blue light penetrates deeper into water than the longer wavelengths, such as red. And so these red algae can live at great depths in the ocean. Some of them are found closer to the surface and they look more green or black, but you can always isolate that red pigment. Also, their cell walls contain either agar, which is what we use in the lab for solid media because very few organisms can break down agar. Also, some of them have carrageenan in their cell walls, and we use that as thickening agents in everything from toothpaste to ice cream to you name it. Next up are the phaeophyta, or the brown algae. In this area, the most well-known example of brown algae are the kelp or seaweed. They're found in great kelp forests off of the northern California coast, clear up to Washington and up through southern Alaska. And they form an important part of the food chain. Now, phaeophyta have a very interesting gamete that has two flagella. It has a whip-like flagellum and a hairy flagellum. Genetic analysis has shown that organisms that have this type of gamete are all related, and they have been put in provisionally into the kingdom Straminophila. So brown algae would be an example of this. Next up are the Christophyta, or yellow algae, golden algae, and diatoms like this lovely example here. It's a very diverse group. They have different types of cell wall composition and pigments. They are unified by all using the polysaccharide crystallolaminaria as a storage product. So that's one of the things that links them. Another thing that links them is this funky gamete with the hairy flagellum. So they are put into the Straminophila kingdom as well. Now, Christophyta form the base of the food chain. Diatoms are photosynthetic, and they are an important part of plankton. Also, their silica cell walls survive after they die. They float down to the bottom of the ocean, and we end up using this diatomaceous earth in polishing. We use it in toothpaste and all sorts of good stuff because it's a good polishing agent. Lastly are the water molds. Water molds have made many trips through many groups. Originally, they were classified as molds because, well, they look like mold. I had a goldfish that ended up looking exactly like this, and I thought it was mold. Turns out they don't have chitin in their cell walls, so they're kicked out of the water mold family. So they ended up in Protista, but as it turns out, they're more closely related to the algae. In fact, they've got this gamete with the two flagella, so they are now in Straminophila. What we think happened is they were an algae that lost their ability to photosynthesize. When they lost the ability to photosynthesize, they had to go to a heterochemotrophic lifestyle. So a lot of them survive by decomposing dead flesh, and they're an important part of carbon cycling on the planet. Well, some of them made the step from decomposers to pathogens. And one of them, Phytophthora infestans, caused the great potato blight of the 1800s. Caused the Irish potato famine, and over, I think it was 2 million Irish died during that famine. Lots of others immigrated, because if there's no food and you've got the ability, it's better to leave. And that's when the Kennedys came to the United States. Also, in 2013, there was an outbreak of Christmas tree rot, which was threatening Christmas. And they were talking about this as being a mold that was attacking the roots of the evergreen trees. And as it turns out, it's in the genus Phytophthora. So it was not a mold, but a water mold. This funky organism that we have a hard time deciding what group it should belong in. That's it for this topic of the algae. Here is a table that summarizes the characteristics of various algae. I've added the water molds. And here are reminders of the learning objectives for this topic.